The 15th chapter of your textbook is entitled The History of Life. We're going to summarize a history of biology. You've learned a lot about biology throughout the text. Now we're going to put this all together into the story of history. First of all, we must realize that history is His story. It is the story of God. It's an illustration of God's nature. It's an illustration of God's glory. The story of organisms is also closely tied to the story of the ruler of organisms. And remember, humans have been were created in the beginning to be the rulers over the organisms of the earth. And so actually the story of biology, the story of organisms, is a story of humanity. Notice that when man was blessed, the organisms were also blessed. At the end of the creation of animals and then humans, both animals and humans were blessed in the process. When humans were cursed, when humans sinned, and thus a curse was brought down upon the creation, it was organisms that were also cursed at the same time. When Cain was cursed, there was a curse on organisms as well, because he was told that the ground would not be able to yield what it did before. So the ground and plants were cursed as a consequence of the curse on Cain. When humans were destroyed in the flood and a remnant preserved, organisms were also destroyed and a remnant preserved. In fact, when a covenant was promised to humans, to Noah, God also clarified that He was going to make a covenant with the animals as well. He blessed, in that case, He covenanted with the humans at the same time that He covenanted with animals. When the curse, according to Romans chapter 8, when the curse is finally lifted from humans, when they are glorified, the curse is going to be lifted off organisms as well. We learn in the Bible that life's history, the life of organisms, is parallel to, closely tied to, the story of the relationship between God and man. So as we learn the history of organisms, we also learn about the relationship between God and man. So let's examine this issue first, beginning with biblical chronology. In the New Testament, if you only had the New Testament to deal with, you probably wouldn't think that chronology was a big issue. You probably wouldn't think that God thought it was an important issue, because there's a lack of chronology in the New Testament. It isn't that it's completely absent, but there's some conspicuous absences of chronology in the New Testament. There's no clear timeline, for example, of Christ's life on earth. People have struggled to try to reconstruct the exact sequence of events during the 3 years of His public ministry. We can produce a timeline, but it's challenging to do so. We are not told precisely of when Christ's birth is. We're not told when the various apostles lived, and especially when they died. We know very little about the rest of their life, even almost nothing about the life before. We know very little about when the various books of the New Testament were written. And then when we get to our age, when we're looking at our time period, we're living in what's called the church age. If you study the New Testament to find reference to the thousands of years that have elapsed since Christ's return to heaven and His return to earth, which is promised, there's very little indication that there's 2,000 years or more in that period of time. And then you have 2 Peter chapter 3, where it says that one day is with the Lord is 1,000 years, and 1,000 years is a day. You put together from this a conclusion that chronology probably doesn't mean very much to God, at least when He's speaking to man about his salvation and how he ought to live and so on. However, you go to the Old Testament and you have a very different story. In the Old Testament, chronology is a very important item indeed in that part of the Scripture. The first words of the Scripture are Bereshit, in the beginning. The days of creation are found in the first chapter of the Bible, as if we have a chronology of 6 and even 7 consecutive days. We have, when we create the sun, the moon, the stars, God said these are put in place to be markers of their signs and seasons and days and years. They're time markers of time. Then we have genealogies in Genesis 5, Genesis 11. We have in Genesis 5, a whole chapter devoted to so-and-so begat so-and-so and lived for so many years and so on. The genealogies there are actually containing time indicators. In the New Testament we have genealogies. The New Testament is opened with a genealogy. This is the book of Jesus Christ, the son of David, the son of Abraham. Abraham begat Isaac, Isaac begat Jacob, Jacob begat Judas and his brother, and so on. But there's no time indicators there. It's just one person begetting another person, begetting another person. No indication of time. In Genesis 5, however, in marked contrast, we have Adam lived for 130 years and begat a son. And then after he begat his son, he lived for 800 more years, and the total number of years that Adam lived were 930 years. And so it goes for each of them. There are time indications in the genealogies of Genesis 5 and 11. In fact, those particular genealogies are unique not just in the Bible, compared to the New Testament, but they're unique in the ancient Near East. We don't know of any other genealogies in any other cultures that systematically go through and list not just the how long total number of years somebody lived, but actually give the number of years that a father lived before he begat his son. That kind of information, giving the amount of time the age of a father at the birth of his son, that we can use to build a chronology. That's not found in any other chronologies in the Scriptures, except Genesis 5 and 11. And it's not found in Egypt. It's not found in Mesopotamia. We have no other culture that actually produces such genealogies as this. They seem to be chrono-genealogies, built and included for the purpose of deducing chronology. We also have rather precise time statements in the Old Testament. The beginning of the flood, for example, in Genesis 7:11, in the 600th year of Noah's life, in the first month and the 17th day, on the same day were all the fountains of the great deep broken up. And it gives you not just the year, but it gives you the month and the day that the flood began. And then in Genesis chapter 8, we have the parallel passage that indicates in the 601st year, in the second month, on the 27th day, the whole thing is over and they get out of the ark. Very precise to the day indications of time. We also have what I call summary time statements in the Old Testament. We're told that the people of Israel left Egypt 430 years to the day from when the promise was given to Abraham. We're then told in the dedication of the temple that the dedication of the temple was a certain number of exact years since the Exodus. So there's indications of periods of time there that allow you to mark out time rather precisely from the creation all the way up to the beginning of the New Testament, the birth of Christ. You can produce a chronology from creation to Christ, which is actually rather accurate in the sense of the possible errors in there are only in the matter of a couple centuries from the biblical text alone. If we assume the biblical text is true, then we deduce that the creation is about 4,000 years, plus or minus a couple of centuries, before the birth of Christ. And there's not much possible leeway there, even if you consider the Septuagint text and the numbers therein. That puts Solomon at about 1000 BC, which fits archaeological data, puts Abraham at about 2000 BC, which most people would agree with, puts the creation at about 4000 BC. Scripture, as we've just said, makes very specific claims about chronology. It claims that the creation is so-and-so years old. It claims that the flood occurred this many years after the creation, and so on and so forth. The Scripture makes claims. It makes cognitive statements that we can understand, we can choose to reject, but it's making actual statements about time. In contrast, the creation about us makes no statements about time. You look at the moon, it doesn't tell you how old it is. It doesn't indicate how old it is. You go to a plant, you go to an animal, you go to a rock. No matter what you look at or listen to in the creation makes no cognitive statements. It doesn't say anything. It doesn't tell you how old the creation is. It doesn't tell you when it came to be. It doesn't give you a chronology. In order to develop a chronology from the creation, you have to infer it. You cannot listen to it or read it. You have to infer it. You have to take the data that you have in the creation. You have to make assumptions about history and then deduce from that how old things really are. In that case, you could easily be wrong about what actually happened, the assumptions that you make about those things, and so you could be seriously wrong about the age of things. There's a huge contrast here between Scripture that makes claims and the creation that does not. And if we wanted to decide which is true, the inferences we make about the creation and versus the claims of Scripture, we might want to make decisions the way they do in a courtroom. In a courtroom, we take evidence and we weigh that evidence to determine which is more reliable. In the courtroom, we will choose, for example, eyewitness testimony over non-eyewitness testimony. If you do not have an eyewitness of a particular crime, you collect the circumstantial evidence. You collect other evidence, make assumptions about the origin of that evidence, and deduce from those assumptions how that evidence came to be. And that you can use in a case, and in fact you can use it persuasively enough to cause a person to be convicted beyond a shadow of a doubt of a crime. But if in the midst of such a case based only on circumstantial evidence, an eyewitness is presented, comes in and says, I've seen this there, and they turn out to be reliable, then all that circumstantial evidence is placed as secondary. The eyewitness is going to be believed over the circumstantial evidence. In a similar way, the creation is basically a set of circumstantial evidences of what happened in the past. As scientists, we can go out into the creation, pick up that data, make assumptions about how it came to be and what has happened to it since its origin. But when we present that as evidence of its antiquity, of what happened to it and when, it is circumstantial evidence. The question is there any eyewitness evidence of the events of the creation, of the origin of these things that should be considered? And I would suggest, yes, there is. There is one eyewitness. There was only one eyewitness to the origin of all things, and that was God Himself. That is God Himself. And that eyewitness is still alive. That eyewitness also is a really good eyewitness. This is an eyewitness who cannot lie. This is an eyewitness who created our language, so he certainly is capable of communicating with us and being understood if he so chose to be understood. It's also an eyewitness who understood what happened, fully understood what happened, even more so than any other eyewitness that might have been there. God himself is a great eyewitness. The question only becomes, did he write it down? Or did he in witnessing those events, did he share that? Is he willing to get on the stand and say what actually happened? And I would suggest once again, yes. We have his eyewitness testimony given to us in the Bible. He supernaturally inspired the information on the origin of things to human beings. He gave his eyewitness account. And he gave it in a genre of historical narrative that is the very kind of genre that you would want a witness on the witness stand to give the information in the form of. God testified. He testified on the stand as to what happened. He gave it to us in historical narrative. We have it in the Bible itself. As a consequence, the claims of Scripture have priority over the inferences of science when it comes to the chronology, to any issues on the origin of the universe, the origin of organisms. It should be that the Bible's claims are accepted over the science of human beings. The science of human beings is a human interpretation of the evidence. The biblical claims are God's eyewitness testimony. When we turn to Scripture, therefore, to look at what it has to say, it also suggests to us why it is that science might actually arrive at wrong conclusions about history. For example, in 2 Peter chapter 3, verses 3 and 4, we read that in the last days, scoffers will come that argue that all things continue as they were from the beginning of the creation. These are people who say, I'm going to make this assumption. I'm going to make the assumption that everything that's happening now is the way it's always been, all the way back. And because of that, I can conclude that, it goes on to say, that there was no creation, there was no flood, and so on. And there's going to be no return of Christ in the future. The biblical account says these people are actually knowingly rejecting the existence of the creation and the existence of the flood. What does this indicate? This suggests that events occurred in the flood and events occurred in the creation which are not happening in the present. If a person observes what's in the present and assumes that that's the way it's always been into the past, this account says they're going to be wrong, because the creation and the flood are going to be contrary to that assumption. That suggests that the creation does involve events and processes which are not occurring in the present. So if science is studying the present and using that to infer what happened in the past, then according to this passage of Scripture, the scientists will be completely wrong when it comes to studying things that happened in the creation. They will also be wrong in studying the things in the flood if they assume that the present processes operated during the flood. In regards to the creation, we're told in the creation week that at the end of the week, God ended his creation, which he had done. So he was doing something in the creation week, namely creating things, that he used processes that he stopped at the end of the creation week. Never again, apparently, going back and doing those things ever again. So in the present, God is not creating because he ended it at the end of the creation week. And so if you study modern processes, you're never going to find one that corresponds to anything that was happening during the creation week. So if you assume modern processes have always occurred, then when you go back in history and get to the creation, you're going to be wrong. You're going to conclude wrong things about history. Then also in the flood, we learn in the biblical account at the end of the flood that God says, I'm never going to do this again. I have destroyed man and beast from off the face of the earth, but I promise that I am never going to do it again. Putting up a rainbow there to promise people that he wouldn't do it again. That means something happened in the flood, maybe a lot of things happened in the flood, that only happened in the flood, they do not happen today, because he's not doing this again. So studying modern processes and applying it to things that happened in the flood, you're likely to come to the wrong conclusions about history. So if we assume no global flood, your history, the history you deduce in that assumption, is going to be wrong. If you assume no creation, the history that you deduce is going to be wrong. So looking at the Bible itself, you have reason to believe that science, without considering the claims of Scripture, will in fact lead to incorrect conclusions about history. When we turn to the specific example of radiometric dating, I think we've got a great example of how this plays out. Radiometric dating is a process used to date rocks and sometimes fossils, but mostly rocks. It's based on the fact that certain elements decay, break down into other elements, and they do so at a very consistent, constant rate in the present. So much so consistent is that rate of decomposition or degeneration, radiation, that they can be used as a clock. They can be used to date things very precisely if you make some assumptions. If you assume, for example, that you know exactly how much parent element, you got radioactive decay involves a parent element decaying to a daughter element. If you know the exact amount of parent, the exact amount of daughter at the beginning, if you know the rate of decay has been the same as it is today from that point to the present, and if you know that nobody has put some daughter in or taken daughter out or taken out parent or added parent, as long as you know all those things, if you know all that, then you can deduce the age of things in that manner. Radiometric dating, especially carbon-14 dating, fits the Bible quite well back to about 1000 BC. But then, beginning at that point, going backwards, it begins putting dates on things that the Bible dates at different values. In fact, it typically gets greater and greater ages as we get further and further back. Something is wrong with the assumptions that we make about radiometric dating that gives wrong ages. When we look at rocks that we think were formed in the creation week, for example, got some examples here. We can use more than one dating method on a given rock. So here we have a rock, we can call it rock A, and I'm using actual dates from an actual rock here in this particular instance. Using the uranium-238 lead-206 method, we can get an age of in the range of 1900 million years, or 1.9 million years. But the same rock, using lead-lead dating, gives an age of about 2200 million, or 2.2 billion years. Use the same rock with uranium-235-207, you get about 2400 million, or 2.4 billion years. Those aren't the same. Even when you consider the ranges don't overlap. These three different methods on the same rock give ages that do not overlap. What's going on here? Which one of the ages is true? I would suggest none of them are true. But the fact that they're not overlapping, they're different, suggests that something's wrong with radiometric dating. And I would suggest that it's the assumption that things haven't changed since the creation, that the modern processes have always been the same through into the past. This, I believe, is evidence that things have changed from the past and that you can't use modern rates of decay to understand how old things really are. Here's another example from another rock. We've got about 1.8 million years with the first method, about 2 billion years for the second method, about 2.4 billion years for the third method. Again, they don't overlap, they give different ages. You can go to example after example, consistently different methods applied to the same rock give systematically different ages. And notice, the first method for each of these rocks gave the smallest age. The third method for each of the rocks gave the largest age. It isn't random. It isn't that these things are just wrong. It's that these things are systematically wrong in a particular direction, indicating we're probably making the wrong assumptions here. If we put the wrong assumptions in, I would suggest we would get the right ages. What we can deduce at this point is that radiometric dating cannot be used with the assumption of modern decay rates, or we're going to get the wrong answer. So we have reason to believe that we can turn to the Bible's chronology. It is, in fact, the biblical chronology which ought to be considered and should be considered more reliable. And again, why? Because this is God's eyewitness testimony of what actually happened. It has precedence over any inferences that we would make from circumstantial evidence such as radiometric dating. Let us turn to Scripture to determine the history of life.